Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. Now I'm going to explain to you why do we need to deduct the normal loss when you want to calculate the CPU. Okay, when you calculate the CPU, hopefully you still remember CPU is taken as the formula is input cost minus the normal loss at scrap value divided by the input quantity minus the normal loss in terms of the quantity. Okay, when we want to calculate the CPU, we have to deduct the normal loss here. So the question is why? All right. So the answer is when you, I'm going to explain this based on three different scenarios. Okay. If you can still remember, if we have normal loss, who's going to bear the cost of normal loss? Okay, if you can still remember previously I've explained to you about the treatment in account for your normal loss. So normal loss, the cost of normal loss is borne by the remaining good units. If you have any normal loss, then the cost, you incur cost. So who's going to bear that cost? So the cost will be borne by the good units. So here, the cost of your normal loss will be borne by the good units, all right? And then I'm going to explain this based on three different scenarios. Okay, let's say scenario one, you don't have any losses. So no losses. If you don't have any losses, then you don't have any, this one, no normal, non-losses. So if let's say, I'm just taking small figure. Let's say your input cost is 10 ringgit. Okay, or 10,000 ringgit whatsoever. I just take small figure. Let's say 10 ringgit and you have 5 units. You have 10 ringgit and 5 units. So how much is the cost per unit? So the cost per unit will be 10 divided by 2. So you will get 2 ringgit per unit. So each of these each of these chairs will be 2 ringgit per unit. The cost is 2 ringgit per unit. Now, let's say in scenario 2, you have losses. If you have loss, but now that loss have no scrap value, okay, some default with the leg of the chair, for example. So you have losses, but that losses have no scrap value. So if let's say you incur, the formula is like here, if the CPU remains the same, your input cost minus your normal loss. Here, your normal loss is 0 in terms of the value and the quantity. In scenario 2, now let's say the value is 0. You don't have any value for your losses, but you have a loss here. So you cannot use this one chair. So, but that chair incur cost. The cost of production is 10. So who's going to bear the cost of that loss? Okay, the cost of that loss will be borne by the remaining four good chairs, four remaining good units. Okay, so that will be the cost that you incur is 10 ringgit divided by 5 minus 1 unit. You have loss of your 1 unit is a loss. So 5 minus 1, you will get 4. So 2 ringgit and 50 is the cost per unit. That means now you incur a cost, that cost of 50 cent will of 2 ringgit will be shared equally among the remaining four. That means each chair will carry 50 cent each. So instead of the cost being 2 ringgit, because of you incur a loss, that loss will be borne by the good unit. So the good units, instead of the cost being 2 ringgit per unit here, if you don't have any losses, but now if you have a loss, the cost of that loss will be borne by the remaining good units. That means instead of the cost being 2 ringgit, now the cost being 2 ringgit and 50 cent each. Okay. Okay, then in the third scenario, if let's say now that particular loss have some scrap value. Here the scrap value is 0, but you have one loss. But now in scenario 3, that particular loss that you incur, you have some scrap value. Okay, let's say now for in scenario 3, let's say the value is 60 cent. Okay, let's say you have a certain value of that loss, and let's say the value is 60 cent. So what happened? What happened to your CPU? So your CPU now becomes 2 ringgit and 35. Okay, if let's say 10 ringgit now minus 60 cent, you have four good units. Okay, so that cost per unit becomes now 2 ringgit and 35. That means instead of the cost being 2 ringgit and 50 compared to scenario 2, because your loss now have some scrap value, you can sell, someone wants to buy this chair for example, and then he or she will repair that chair. So that means now you've got 60 cent out of that. So it's kind of a value rather than you are looking from the that particular loss as a certain value. So that value has reduces your cost. So instead of your cost being 2 ringgit and 50 cent each, because of that particular loss have some scrap value, so your CPU now reduced by that amount. So your CPU becomes 2 ringgit and 35. So hopefully you get some understanding for this. That means you would ask why you have to deduct the normal loss here when you want to calculate the CPU. Why we don't simply take the input quantity, input cost divided by the input quantity, but you have to adjust for the normal loss. The reason why we need to adjust for the normal loss is because the cost of that normal loss will be borne by the good units. How does the good units bear the cost? So the good units bear the cost by putting them into this formula, right? So you can see from this example, if you don't have any losses, then the cost per unit is 2. But if you have a loss, then the cost will become higher. The cost becomes 2.50. But if let's say that loss have some scrap value, it reduces the cost by that particular value. Okay, with that, I thank you.